What our schools are supposed to be are incubators of our democracy. We want to make sure that our students are good citizens. We want to make sure that they know how to vote, that they know how to be engaged, and that they know how to make the world a better place.
I think it's really important that we encourage instead of try to silence conversations about race in schools to foster more understanding.
Students want to talk about these subjects and they're not always allowed, or they're sometimes censored in the classroom.
Ignoring the problem will just teach students to ignore the problem in their adult life.
We do not live in a race-neutral society. We live in a society where there is racial disparity. There is issues that fall along the lines of race, and we need to be aware of that.
Hi, everyone. This is Ken Peternick, the host of Courageous Conversations about our schools. Today, we have some very special guests from the state of Kentucky. They're all high school students and members of the Student Voice Team, an organization that was formed in 2012 by a small group of high school students who wanted to ensure that all students like them, have a voice in the way Kentucky public schools are run. Their website says, "We are young people co-creating more just, democratic Kentucky schools and communities as research, policy, and advocacy partners." For this conversation, I will be asking them about an important research project they completed recently that reflects the views of over 11,000 Kentucky high school students about race and racism and the way their schools are dealing with these topics. Their report is called Race to Learn. Let's meet these students.
Hi, everyone. I'm Connor Flick. I'm a senior at the Gann Academy in Bowling Green, Kentucky. I'm the cross-organizational coordinator for the Kentucky Student Voice Team, which means I lead a lot of the mission and messaging that the team tries to do in our work.
My name is Isha Bajwa, and I'm a senior at Fern Creek High School, located in Louisville, Kentucky. And I have recently joined as a student reporter, so I've worked on the blog and other teams associated with the research that we have done so far.
My name is Sarah Falucci, and I am a junior at Paul Lawrence Dunbar High School in Fayette County, which is located in Lexington, Kentucky, so central Kentucky. And I do work for the Student Voice Forum, which is our editorial board, the Get Schooled podcast. I help out with climate audits and sort of dabble in some other stuff.
Hi, I'm Hayden Watkins, a sophomore at Round County Senior High School in Moorhead, Kentucky, which is in eastern Kentucky. I'm new to the team, but I've had a lot of fun being involved so far. I'm a quantitative analyst, and I've been working on the podcast that Sarah mentioned as well.
My name is Rima Dutt, and I am a sophomore at DuPont Manual High School, which is located in Louisville, Kentucky. And I also have recently joined the team as a student researcher on the Race to Learn projects, as well as climate audits.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks for introducing yourselves. Let's get right into letting our listeners know about the Student Voice Team. And could someone explain a little bit what the team is about? How did it get off the ground, and what is it really about? What is its purpose?
We founded it in 2012 in a coffee shop between a couple students and one teacher that felt very strongly about student voice and what we could be doing more in the future to really make sure that we're having student voice in our legislature and our schools, and making sure that students are a part of the education decision making that's happening so frequently within our school systems. And so we've evolved a lot since that point in 2012. We're about 10 years into our work now. Last year, we have spun off from our parent organization, the Pritchard Committee. And so we are coming into our own now. We are in our first full year of being the Kentucky Student Voice Team, and you set our mission outright, and it's something that we really stand by. It's something that we've been crafting for a long time now, and the organization as it stands today is, like I said, constantly evolving and growing. And so we've never really, in my opinion, fully started. We've just kind of continued the work and pushed forward fighting for students.
So one of the things that you do, based on what you just said and what I read from the website, is that you conduct research. And maybe one of you could explain what some of your studies have been about.
I'll take that one up too really fast, okay, and point out that over the past 10 years, we've done a lot of different work in a lot of different fields, both within research and outside of that. So some of the major highlights of our work have been Powerful Promise, which is an issue from a few years back to where we found that Kentucky lottery funds, which are typically earmarked to go towards scholarships for students to get post-secondary education, were being diverted towards other funds and not going to the students that they were supposed to be serving. We've been able to evolve that since then, and we've been able to direct a lot of the funding back into students' hands and making sure that they can get scholarships. We've also published a book focusing on the role of post-secondary education and students' outcomes and how their experiences in applying for post-secondary education have really evolved over time and what that means for a lot of Kentucky students. And then more recently, we've published our Coping with COVID study, which has examined kind of the lives of students across the state, over 13,000 respondents, really trying to dig into what it means to be a student during a pandemic and how their education has been affected, not necessarily in terms of the educational gaps or in terms of their academic performance, but more their social lives and how they're experiencing education and how they feel about their future. And then the most recent thing that we've done is our Race to Learn study, which we're super excited to share with you today, which examines 10,000 student responses all across the state, particularly from rural areas, about how students feel about race in schools and how students are experiencing the differences and diversities that come with being a student in public education. So it's been a great experience working through all of these projects, and we're super, super excited to share with you more about the Race to Learn study today.
Could you share, or could someone share a few details about the methodology and how did you conduct the study? And again, how many students in the state participated?
Yeah, so in terms of like the methodology aspect of it, there was a lot of discourse that we had as researchers in terms of the qualitative, like our open-ended responses that we received, because we wanted to make sure that every response was authentic, and when we included it in the report, that we weren't erasing any student voices. So and part of our methodology, we kind of had a debate about what should we kind of edit in terms of like grammar versus spelling. And one thing that we kind of came to an agreement on was that spelling was something we could possibly correct so that those who are reading the report, other than students, would take it in a serious light that these students have a lot to say. But in terms of grammar, we were going to try to keep it authentic because that is their original voice. Depending on where you're from, you might use different grammar rules. So that's one example of something we included in the methodology because we wanted to make sure that student voices were not erased and they weren't tokenized and that they were as authentic as possible. And that's something that we all kind of worked on together.
I'll also add to that response and just mention that in terms of the distribution, we've really relied a lot on a lot of rock star teachers to get this work done. It was a lot of interpersonal connections, a lot of relying on the networks that we had to make sure that not only were we able to distribute our survey and get 11,000 responses from students all across the state and nearly every Kentucky county, which there's a lot of them. So we really tried to spread out and make sure that we hit all our bases there. It really relied on our individual efforts, and it really relied on certain researchers and certain professors and certain teachers saying, we'll step up, we'll get this to the students we know, we'll make sure that the survey has the right questions on it, we'll help you refine the ideas that are on here, we'll make sure that this really guides us towards the data and towards the information that we really feel like we need to come out of this and to fill the gap of research that just isn't being done right now on this issue.
I have to believe in Kentucky, there's a lot of division, political and racial, ethnic division, and issues around race and ethnicity are really right at the center of the culture wars in this country. And I can't imagine that Kentucky's any different. So I would love to hear you talk about how you were able to conduct a study about race and racism in a climate where there are these divisions, and whether you ran into any resistance along the way when you proposed doing the study and actually conducted it.
The topic of race is something that's been heavily politicized, especially, within Kentucky, but also looking at it at a national level. There have been a lot of conversations about race and education and where they intersect. And while when we put this study out, we had a lot of respondents and a lot of people who helped us with the study who were very, very eager to have these conversations, because this is something very important to a lot of Kentucky students who may not otherwise have the chance to speak up about it. We did also receive, some backlash within our responses, either from students or even from legislators, where this topic is viewed as something highly contentious or perhaps racist in nature. Even the discussion of race in schools, it can be in some ways thought of as a very vulnerable conversation. There's a lot of delicacy and nuance to it. And I know that there were a lot of people who were very, very eager to talk about it and, highlight some of those nuances. But we did experience some resistance with that, some people who weren't super content with the topic or the conversations being had.
Their answer to this question was not what I had anticipated. I could imagine school officials not agreeing with all of the recommendations the students might be offering later, but I was taken aback to hear that some thought a study designed by students to learn about race and racism was viewed as racist. Seems to me that's like saying that doing a study to understand why students drop out from school and what might be done to reduce the dropout rate would actually cause more students to drop out. Maybe the real reason for the resistance to doing a study about race is fear about what students might uncover. Despite some resistance to doing the study, the students carried on. And here is Rima describing their key findings.
Yeah, so we had 6 major key findings. Each of the findings touched on different aspects. Our first finding having to do with confronting racism, in which we found that 46% of the students reported that their schools need to do more to confront racism, showing how students feel the urge that they see the disparities in their everyday school environment, and how students of color specifically reported that 28% of students of color reported that race both positively and negatively impacts their education, in which we see that having to grow up in these environments to hear phrases that put them down undermine them as people, and while their students who are white are oblivious to what the effects of what they are saying are. And our second finding had to do with racial and ethnic representation in the classroom, in which we found that 46% of students of color reported that their racial and ethnic group is rarely represented in textbooks and in learning, in which 31% have never had the opportunity to talk about their own experiences on their races in the classroom. And this really shows how students of color are not represented in the learning material, causing many of their white peers to be oblivious to what their experiences are, which may cause them to say these things without really knowing the reasoning. And a quote that I think really stands out and talks about this, it comes from a senior who's Black at Fayette County. He said, "We barely talk about Black history unless it's Black History Month, and we shouldn't be important for only a month." Our third finding had to do with perceptions of equitable rule enforcement, in which 1 in 5 students reported that rules are never or rarely fairly enforced for students of different racial backgrounds. Students of colors are almost always receive a more severe punishment, in which students of color have to be more cautious of their race and identity in their everyday life. Our fourth finding had to do with racial and ethnic exclusion, in which we found that 31% of students often hear students make insensitive comments about race and ethnicity in school. Racial slurs create an uncomfortable learning environment for many of these students, which doesn't allow them to feel safe, and knowing how important it is for students to have a safe environment when learning, to properly learn and really experience a more positive learning environment is extremely important. And there was a quote that again really stood out to me, and it said, "Every day it's like insensitive and racist comments flying around me all the time." That came from Hardin County, a senior who was Black. Our fifth finding had to do with teacher diversity, in which 38% of students of color reported that since kindergarten, they have never had a teacher with a similar racial or ethnic background as them. It really highlights how adult representation is such a large impact on the learning experience. And when students of color don't have teachers with the same racial and ethnic representation, it creates a barrier and advantage that white students have over them. And our last finding had to do with racial and ethnic conversation beyond the classroom. 78% of students surveyed reported to have several friends of races and ethnicities different from their own. And within that 78%, 39% regularly have conversations about race and ethnicity outside of the classroom, showing that students have friends of different race and ethnicities, and they are having these conversations outside of classrooms, which show that students want to talk about these subjects, and they're not always allowed, or they're sometimes censored in the classroom and told they're not allowed to speak up on it.
I was especially intrigued by this last finding, that most students want more opportunities to discuss race and ethnicity in class, and at times aren't even allowed to have such discussions. I wanted the students to help me understand why they thought this was the case.
I feel like it's because many teachers are not, they don't know how to handle these conversations in a respectful manner without insulting one race, and they just choose to avoid it.
So I think part of it was kind of this fragility that Raima touched on a little bit about how like teachers are really afraid of insulting students, but also just not, some teachers aren't equipped with the training or even just informal knowledge about diversity and acceptance, and just knowledge about what racism like manifests currently for students. So I think part of it is issues of diversity in schools. If you look at more rural schools in Kentucky, students, teachers aren't as exposed to diversity, or even if they are exposed to it, they don't know how to handle it or how to properly address it. And so I think it just is rooted in that fear and almost like white fragility, if you want to go there, in the sense that teachers are just afraid of what could possibly go wrong, and or just simply don't know what to say on it, so they choose not to, just to be silent on it.
So I want to come to your recommendations in a moment, but I just want to ask you a question about these culture wars that are erupted all over the country around education. And of course, you're quite familiar with the skirmish around critical race theory, and the charge from many people who think and support the idea that it should be banned. And there are many states that have banned it, school districts that have banned it, although it's usually not very clear that the people banning it define what critical race theory is. But it's essentially banning conversations about race and racism. And the reason that they support those bans in many cases is because they believe that it creates division, that it causes people to hate each other, or it causes white students to feel guilty, or it causes students of color to feel victimized. I just wonder if any of you would love to hear your thoughts about that problem or that question, or the questions surrounding the debate on critical race theory. Sarah.
I think one thing that's important to consider with schools is that schools by nature intend to prepare people for interactions in the broader world. And I think with that comes the need for students to recognize the history of the places we live and interact with and the people we coexist with. And I think that's a very critically important facet of it. And I think the politicization and, the way that race, discussions of race in school have been made highly controversial really shows a distance from the truth that for students of color, they don't have the option, or even, you could say the privilege, to distance themselves from the impact and the disparities they face in the education system due to their own ethnicity and race, and that for many, white students, it can be easy to say that the discussion of race in schools is something, highly contentious and can create divisions. But the truth is that for students of color, they they have these marginalized identities, and they can't go about their daily lives pretending as if that's not part of them, and that pride for their own identity is something really critically important. So I think with these conversations, sometimes there's a negligence of the fact that we need to consider that students don't necessarily have the opportunity to completely forget the way that race plays a part in really every part of this nation's history and education by default. And I think it's really important that we encourage, instead of try to silence, conversations about race in schools to foster more understanding for students with other students and also people in the greater world. So that's one thing I would say to those national conversations. I think it's really critically important that we talk about race in schools.
Are there benefits to white students who engage in these conversations about race and racism?
I think there is, because even if you don't particularly come from a background of being a marginalized ethnicity or race within schools, even if you're a white student, there's still importance to talking about race and ethnicity and really understanding it. I think that's something that you can take with you. And I think it's important that students of color don't have to bear the brunt of having to be constantly conscious and having to become the educators in the education system they are trying to learn from, and that they don't have to be the ones forced to educate other students and teachers about the impact that the education system and this country's history has on their own identity. And I think white students should learn about race, and that's something that shouldn't be put to be faced by students of color themselves. And I can pass it off to Connor.
This is Connor speaking. I have kind of dual pronged thoughts on this. I'm going to take a little bit of Sarah's thought here about how really what we see for our education systems and what we really hope to have come out of them is the sense that education can help prepare our students for the real world, and education can help prepare our students for what comes next and living in the society that they're growing up in. And what we really see is that, at least in the United States, we do not live in a race-neutral society. We live in a society where there is racial disparity. There is issues that fall along the lines of race, and we need to be aware of that. And so for a white student, having that awareness and having that knowledge and understanding that the world isn't always going to be race neutral. The world is going to affect people of different races differently. And knowing how to be aware of that, and knowing that ideally we can move away from that and we can move towards a race neutral world, is something that we need to start having conversations with from that sort of K through 12 perspective. Because when students are already having these conversations outside of class, and students are going to have these conversations as adults, and they're going to grow up in a society that isn't strictly race neutral, when we're suddenly teaching, you have to not be aware of this, race isn't a thing, this isn't something you need to be concerned about, you're not supposed to be having these conversations, and then they're turning around and doing the same things. Do we want students to be having uninformed conversations that can go south very quickly, to where some students are using slurs, some students are not being attentive to the issue, some students are deeply misinformed about the role in the race in this country? Or do we want them to be aware of the facts and the knowledge that we know exists, so you can actually move towards that race neutral world and make sure that we can actually be in a world to where that sort of history and that sort of privilege and that sort of discrimination no longer happens, because we're aware of it and we're actively seeking to overcome it. Simply saying it doesn't exist doesn't make it go away.
You listed all of the findings, and I wonder if you could talk about the recommendations that came out in your report.
Yeah, of course. So we split up our recommendations into 3 categories. 1, recommendations for students, then recommendations for teachers, and lastly, recommendations for administrators and policymakers. So starting off with students, we know that it might seem like they can't do much, but one of the first things we recommend is for them to be aware of the disparities between them and their peers against racism, and how some of these students may benefit from the cycle of racism. Second, we want them to seek to educate themselves about racism and how it affects others, even though if it's not taught in the classroom. We want them to be uncomfortable and ask questions. For teachers, we have 4 main recommendations. Number 1, to establish a zero tolerance policy for racial slurs to create a safer learning environment. Second, we want them to encourage respectful conversation about the history of racism and how it still continues to affect students of color. Next, we want them to avoid segregating lessons about racially and ethnic diversity. We don't want them only teaching about Black history during Black History Month. We want them to seek out themselves to incorporate race in their lesson plans. And lastly, we want them to ensure representation for students of color in extracurriculars and clubs, as many of them might not feel inclined to join these clubs without the help of a teacher. So for administrators and policymakers, we have a wide variety of recommendations for them. Number 1 being to select racially competent staff, them knowing what is good in the classroom and what is bad. Again, going into encouraging non-biased training about these issues about race and ethnicity, knowing not to favor students just because they are one specific race. Next, on the note about teacher diversity, we want them to recruit more ethnically diverse teachers. As we know, it creates a more welcoming environment for students of color. Next, we want them to foster safe environments and repair past mistakes that they might have not already addressed. Next, we want them to encourage students of colors to speak up about their voices. And leading into, we want them to take student reports seriously. When students know that something is up in their classroom, a lot of the times it goes unnoticed. So we want them to take these into account. Next, we want them to encourage the creation of racial and ethnic clubs to promote inclusion. For example, an Asian student committee where Asian students can continue to learn about their history, as it might not be taught inside the school education system. And lastly, we want them to get feedback from students of color about their school climate, knowing how students feel in these situations. And those are our main recommendations.
Thank you for that, Rima. I want to ask you about one of them, the zero tolerance recommendation when in response to racial slurs and other racist acts. Can you say a bit more about what, and anyone can respond to this, what you think should happen when something happens that is racially motivated?
Yeah, we think that they should give them a punishment or at least acknowledge that, hey, this is wrong and we don't encourage any of these sayings to happen in the classroom, and explaining why they shouldn't say these things.
Terrific. Hayden, how about you?
Ignoring the problem will just teach students to ignore the problem in their adult life. And it's really important that we have these conversations in classroom and attack these prejudices head on, because students need to be trained in school, because school is foundational to your adult life. It's important we have these conversations in schools so that in our adult life, we can address these issues, because ignoring these issues is just going to teach us to ignore the racial prejudices that exist in America and worldwide.
I was thinking about what the students said earlier, that many teachers do not seem comfortable or prepared well enough to talk with students about race. And the finding from their survey, the large majority of students wanted more time for these discussions. I told them about bills passed recently in Texas and other states that limit what teachers can say and do in the classroom with regard to race. One of those restrictions is that teachers cannot be required to participate in training about race or sex stereotyping. If this kind of professional learning for all teachers was prohibited in Kentucky, then it would be impossible to implement one of the students' key recommendations.
We actually saw a very similar language get passed in a separate bill here in Kentucky. And so we're very familiar with some of what's going through in Texas as well, just because of how similar a lot of these bills are. And our main feeling about it is it's really just distress to where seeing this pass through and seeing this legislation come up time and time again across states is really concerning, because we understand that so many teachers want to know more. We weren't able to collect data on this directly, but in our conversations with a lot of people in our network, we know that so many teachers and so many administrators even want to know more about how they can be stepping up more for students of color and how they can make sure that they're creating more equitable environments within their schools. And part of that includes these professional developments. And when we're finding at the same time that it's no longer legal for districts to say we need teachers to come in and understand how their teaching can reinforce stereotypes, how their teaching can reflect a lot of their prejudices that they already have, and how we can overcome them. Instead, the legislature is stepping in and saying, you know what, you can keep these stereotypes in place. If a teacher doesn't want to address the concerns of their students or the problems that they're facing with racial or sex stereotyping, they don't need to. That's deeply concerning, because that can affect students for a very long time. And you can find story after story after story of students that have consistently had that one just bad teacher, to where we've had a lot of rock stars, but just that one bad teacher that treats them poorly on the basis of sex or race. And it really puts them down on a dark path for their educational career and even their career and their social lives in the future, because that sort of understanding of themselves is made a lot more difficult by that one teacher that stereotyped them heavily on their race or sex.
Great. Now, Isha, you want to respond to the same question?
Yes. So one thing that kind of branches off from what Connor was saying was like the sense of distress that a lot of us feel as students hearing about these bills, especially the ones that have very vague language about what history we can teach. And it really kind of makes us wonder, like, whose history are we even teaching to begin with? When we say we can't talk about race, gender, sex, or religion in the classroom, whose history are we really teaching? We're teaching white history. We're teaching Eurocentric history that does completely erases representation of Black and Brown students in the classroom. So I think when we hear these bills, it kind of empowers us to go mobilize. And there are plenty of student orgs across the states. One example that I can name besides us is the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition, and they've been mobilizing and were able to kind of combat some of the censorship bills. But also, even with us, Kentucky Student Voice team, back in January, we organized with with a teacher kind of Facebook group. Connor, you can let me know the name because I kind of forget, but they host an event, and some of our students actually went to the Capitol in Frankfurt. And I kind of think that event in itself kind of shows how if legislators are going to disagree with us and kind of send us backwards, we are not going to stop our fight there with our research. We're going to come to them and show them that not just students are concerned about this issue, but teachers are also on our side and saying, no, this affects how I teach. This is not what I would like either. So I think after having that kind of emotional reaction to the passage of these bills, we see that as an opportunity to go to the legislators and really tell them how, not only how we feel, but also teachers and educators in general view these bills.
Great, thank you for that. Isha, Hayden, you wanted to weigh in on this one.
Yeah, Isha was talking about white history, and something I think is that if we're just teaching white history, that's not American history, because America is a racially diverse country and is growing more racially diverse by the second. And if we can teach the mistakes we've made in the past, we can combat these current racial prejudices that exist in our society and combat more that may arise in the future to make this truly a country of equality, so that race won't be an issue in getting ahead in America, and that everyone can be on a level playing field.
I'm curious to know if the culture wars and the divisions in the state have how they have affected the way that you have released your report and findings and tried to get the word out about what you found and what you're recommending. But talk a little bit about the impact that your report has had and how people have received it. Hayden?
So we first released this report to the public in a pop-up press conference outside of the Capitol Annex in Frankfurt. And ever since that event, this report has kind of been snowballing. We've received a lot of requests to present our findings, like this podcast here today. And we've also got some presentations going on with the American Education Research Association and even the Kentucky Board of Education. And it's really excellent to see this report be having such widespread results, and these conversations about race are happening. And like our report showed, students want this conversation about race to be happening because they're interested and they need to talk about it. And our ultimate goal, one of the recommendations in this report, is to get these conversations in classrooms as well.
Okay, I think we're sort of winding down, getting close to the end, and I really appreciate all the time you've devoted to this conversation. I really would like to promote this episode, and I think you will as well, to other high school students around the country, because I think this is pretty unique that you're doing this work. And for other high school students or adults that they work with in other states, how might they go about conducting their own research like this? What recommendations would you have? Where would they begin?
I can take this question.
Great, thank you, Nisha.
So I think it really starts with just having an passionate and very rooted interest in changing culture and like shifting the dynamics of how school is structured. So it sounds intimidating, but it truly just starts with passionate students who really want to see their schools reflect what they want out of it, because they're the ones going through the education system. They're the ones actively sitting in the classrooms trying to learn. So I think it kind of just starts with creating that network of young students and educators and others that can support you in your process, and then creating like a core group that kind of slowly churns out what the goals are and what kind of I think also just being very curious and inquisitive and like wanting to learn more is definitely a huge part about being a researcher. So kind of starting on the ground, finding people who are also interested in creating that network and just working together to come up with what kind of things you want to explore. It really shouldn't be as intimidating as like research sounds, because oftentimes I feel like research in itself is inaccessible when you think about how many paywalls there are to like access academic journals. And so I really loved being a part of Kentucky Student Voice team, and being a part of the research just goes to show that young people are able and beyond capable of doing this research.
From what I can tell, these students, members of the Kentucky Student Voice team, are indeed beyond capable of conducting meaningful research about their schools. Their survey methodology was sound. Their large sample size was more than adequate to come up with valid and reliable findings. And their recommendations about how to strengthen learning opportunities for all high school students in the state seem eminently sensible, especially since the recommendations were based on what students say they want for their education. My hope is that lawmakers and education officials in the state appreciate and take seriously the recommendations in the Race to Learn report. And if any of them take issue with it, I hope they'll reach out to the team and offer to have a civil and courageous conversation about it.